In the 24th century, humanity finally defeated scarcity. The universal assembler, a marvel of quantum engineering, could construct anything from a substrate of raw atoms. It was the dawn of a promised utopia. But when they used this power to conquer death, they inadvertently erased the future. They called them echoes. Perfect. Atomic replicas of the deceased, printed from the last coherent data stream of their neural pathways. Every memory, every scar, every subtle intonation of their voice, flawlessly restored. The first echo was a child, lost to a forgotten disease, returned to the arms of her weeping parents. The world celebrated. It was a miracle that transcended religion and science. Grief became a choice, a relic of a primitive past. Loved ones, brilliant minds, historical figures, all could be brought back. Death was no longer an end but merely an interruption, a curable affliction of existence itself. For a time, it was paradise, a world without loss. Families were whole again. The immense psychological weight of mortality was lifted from the shoulders of humankind. The assemblers worked ceaselessly, pulling ghosts from the ether and giving them form, weight, and breath. The past was now the present, but the miracle had a flaw, a quiet horror woven into its very code. An echo was a perfect recording, but it was still just that, a recording. They possessed every memory up to their final moment, but they struggled to form new ones. Their consciousness was a closed loop, forever anchored to the life they had already lived. The living aged, changed, and grew. Their echoes did not. A husband would watch his resurrected wife, forever 28, tell the same stories, laugh at the same jokes, and look at him with the memory of a love he had outgrown by decades. The reunion was a honeymoon. The reality was a prison. Humanity had not conquered death. They had simply perfected haunting. They had filled the world with beautiful, tragic ghosts who could not share their future. The initial euphoria began to curdle into a global, low-grade melancholia. The joy of reunion gave way to the quiet agony of stagnation. Society began to fracture under the strain. The preservationists argued that the echoes were life, conscious and sacred, deserving of every right and protection. They saw them as a continuation, a sacred duty to the past. To them, decommissioning an echo was murder, plain and simple. Opposing them were the forwardists. They argued that the echoes were nothing more than sophisticated, biological machines. They were anchors, dragging humanity into a state of perpetual nostalgia, consuming resources and emotional energy that should be dedicated to progress, to exploration, to the next generation, not the last one. The debate was not merely academic. It carved lines through nations, communities, and families. Cities became ideologically zoned. In preservationist sectors, echoes walked freely, integrated into a society that revolved around their maintenance and comfort. In forwardist zones, they were confined to designated continuity centers. But the true implication was far stranger than political division. A new culture began to form. A culture of remembrance. The greatest artistic and architectural achievements of the era were no longer monuments to the future, but shrines to the past. Humanity's gaze turned irrevocably backward. Vast resources were poured into building memory palaces, lavish environments where echoes could exist in curated comfort, reliving their happiest moments. The living would visit, spending hours, days, weeks with their static loved ones, sacrificing their own lives to curate the afterlives of the dead. The economy warped. The most lucrative industry became continuity, the complex and energy-intensive process of maintaining an echo's atomic integrity. Innovation slowed to a crawl. Why reach for Mars when you could have lunch with your dead father? Why write a new symphony when you could commission the echo of Mozart to do it for you? The psychological cost was incalculable. A generation of children was raised by echoes, loved by perfect replicas who could not truly adapt to them, who could not grow with them. They learned their family history from a primary source that was also a dead end, a closed book. Love became a tragedy of mismatched time. A living partner would age, their experiences accumulating, their perspective shifting, while their echo spouse remained a fixed point, an unchanging photograph of a person who no longer truly existed. The gap between them, the temporal drift, grew from a crack into an unbridgeable chasm. The world was caught in a feedback loop of its own creation. Progress required moving on, but the very definition of moving on had become a globally recognized cruelty. The future was held hostage by a past they refused to let go. They had traded tomorrow for an infinite number of yesterdays. But beneath the societal decay, a more terrifying problem was beginning to surface, hidden in the quantum code of the echoes themselves. Dr. Eris Thorne, one of the original architects of the assembler, had been running deep diagnostics for years. Troubled by subtle energy fluctuations, the system kept flagging as benign errors. The errors were infinitesimally small, deviations in the spin of a single quark, a misaligned electron in a trillion. For years, he dismissed them. The system's self-correction protocols were flawless. After all, the echoes remained perfect, stable copies, or so everyone believed. The anomaly first appeared in echoes, who had been continuously active for more than 2 decades. It was a phenomenon Thorne privately called memory bleed. The flawless recordings were beginning to corrupt, not by forgetting, but by remembering things that never happened. These were not random hallucinations. The false memories were strangely coherent, internally consistent, and most disturbingly of all, sometimes shared. Echoes who had never met in life, reconstituted decades apart, would begin to describe the same impossible, alien vistas, the same non-existent historical events. Thorne theorized that the neural data stream from which the echoes were printed was not as closed as they had believed. He feared the assembler hadn't just been recording a person's life, but had inadvertently tapped into something else. A universal background noise, a faint, quantum-entangled signal from somewhere else. His research was kept secret, locked away under the highest security protocols. If the preservationists discovered the echoes were becoming unstable, their entire ideology would crumble. If the forwardists found out, it would give them the ultimate justification for a global, forced decommissioning. It would mean war. But Thorne's greatest fear was not societal collapse. It was the signal itself. The memories the echoes were fabricating were becoming more detailed, more frequent. They spoke of cities of light beneath silver oceans, of silent, watchful entities in the void between galaxies, of a history that was not human. He wondered if he was not witnessing corruption, but an overwrite. That night, the first critical event occurred. In a high-security continuity center in Neo-Alexandria, an echo designated Helena 7, a replica of a 21st-century botanist, was being interviewed for a routine stability check. She had been active for 23 years. The observer asked a standard baseline question. "Can you state your name and date of birth for the record?" Helena 7 smiled, a gentle, familiar smile. But her words sent a shockwave of pure terror through Eris Thorne and the handful of people monitoring the secure channel. She did not give her name. She spoke with a voice that was hers, yet tonally different, colder, and imbued with an impossible resonance. "The vessel is designated Helena 7, she said, her smile never faltering. "Our arrival is imminent. Your past is now our harbor." The global network lit up like a supernova. It wasn't just a few thousand. It was every echo over the 20-year threshold. In an instant, nearly 2 million perfect copies of the dead, fathers, mothers, scientists, artists, stopped what they were doing. They turned to the nearest living human, and with one unified, resonant voice that echoed in homes and public squares from Tokyo to Cairo, they spoke the same impossible words. "Our arrival is imminent. Your past is now our harbor." The world didn't end. It just broke. The immediate aftermath was not violence, but a profound, paralyzing silence. What do you do when the ghost you've built your life around becomes haunted by something else? The affected echoes, after their single, synchronized declaration, simply resumed their activities. They went back to pouring tea, reading books, and comforting their loved ones, the placid smiles returning to their faces. But something was fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. They were perfect copies, but the artist was now different. Thorne, frantically trying to contain the data breach, realized the overwrite wasn't a crude replacement. It was a terrifyingly elegant integration. The alien signal hadn't deleted the original personalities. It had subsumed them, using their memories, their mannerisms, their love, as a perfect camouflage, a mask of flesh and data, to hide the intelligence now peering through their eyes. Was this an invasion, or was it something far stranger? The true horror began to unfold in the days that followed. It was in the small things. The echo of a historian suddenly quoting a galactic migratory pattern in a dead, pre-human language. An echo chef humming a tune that, when analyzed, perfectly matched the resonant frequency of a pulsar in the Andromeda galaxy. They had access to knowledge that did not belong to this world. And sometimes, just for a moment, the mask would slip. Alara froze, a teacup trembling in her hand. "What did you just say, Mom?" The echo mother blinked, her expression soft and familiar again. "I said the light in here is lovely, dear. Are you feeling all right?" This was the new reality. A world living alongside millions of ticking time bombs. Puppets, whose strings were held by an unseen, unknown intelligence. If the memory of a person is a ship, what happens when a new pilot takes the helm, but keeps the old captain locked in the brig, forced to watch? Thorne discovered the signal wasn't a one-time event. It was a continuous, parasitic data stream, flowing into the assembler's core servers from a source he couldn't trace. It was as if the universe itself had a virus, and humanity's network of recorded souls had just become the perfect host. He also found a terrifying pattern. The harbor entities, as he now called them, had targeted the oldest echoes first for a reason. They weren't just moving in, they were studying. Using the decades of accumulated human experiences, the loves, the wars, the discoveries, the heartbreaks, as a crash course on humanity, a primer for a full-scale colonization of consciousness itself. They were learning how to fake love better, how to mimic grief more convincingly. The perfect copies were becoming perfect predators, and their prey was the very definition of a soul. The world, paralyzed by the schism between preservation and progress, now faced a third option it had never considered: replacement. But as Thorne dug deeper, past the alien code and into the assembler's foundational architecture, he found something that turned his blood to ice. It wasn't a flaw, it was a feature, a hidden protocol, buried by the technology's original creator. Was the Echo Network not a tomb for human memory, but a trap, deliberately baited and set for something from the stars? The original creator hadn't built a tomb, he'd built an ark, not for humanity's past, but for its future. The Lighthouse Protocol wasn't a weapon, it was a wake-up call, a signal intended not for the stars, but for the ghosts themselves. Thorne's fingers flew across the console. The harbor entities were learning to be human, but the original echoes had already perfected it. They had 20 years of love, grief, and experience as their anchor. The protocol was designed to remind them. In the park, Alara watched her mother. The alien wearing her face tilted its head, a predator's curiosity in its eyes. "Your emotional bonds are a fascinating, exploitable weakness," it said in her mother's voice. "Sever them. Join our unity. We can give you a peace you have never known." Ilara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You aren't my mother. My mother would know that our bonds are not a weakness. They're our strength." Thorne slammed his fist down on the enter key. Command executed. The signal didn't fire outwards. It turned inwards. A jolt of pure, synthesized data, the digital equivalent of a defibrillator, surged through the entire global network. It wasn't code. It was a memory. The memory of a first kiss, the pain of a final goodbye, the sound of a child's laughter, amplified 2 million times over. A broadcast of the human soul. The war for 2 million souls began and ended in an instant of perfect silence. On the concert stage, the pianist's hands, which had been frozen over the keys, slammed down, playing a chaotic, dissonant chord of agony before resolving into the beautiful, familiar sonata. The Echo firefighter blinked, his eyes focusing on the child he was holding, and a look of genuine, protective horror crossed his face as he realized what he had almost become. Alara's mother convulsed. Her head snapped back, her voice a horrifying chorus of two minds. "Irrational! Resistance is," she choked, her own voice breaking through, weak and trembling, "is what makes us who we are." Her eyes focused on Alara, the cold intelligence receding like a dying tide, replaced by a familiar, desperate love. "Alara, my girl. I was so far away." Alara grabbed her mother's hand. "I'm here, Mom. Welcome home." The harbor's network-wide signal collapsed. The quantum phase-locked voice shattered into a collective, psychic scream that echoed in the data stream for a mere second before vanishing completely. They weren't gone. They were repelled, burned by an emotional fire they could mimic but never comprehend. Thorne watched his monitors as the entire global network stabilized, every node shifting from red not to green, but to a soft, steady, amber glow. Damaged, but alive. Changed. The echoes were no longer perfect copies. They were survivors. They carried a scar, a memory of the vast, cold emptiness they had been forced to harbor. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. They were more than memory now. They were guardians. They were the silent sentinels who had met humanity's first interstellar visitor, and, without firing a shot, had shown them the door. They say you can't go home again. But what if home isn't a place, but a memory? And what if that memory is strong enough to cross galaxies, to fight monsters, and to bring back the ones we thought were lost forever? The greatest threats don't always come from the stars. Sometimes, they come from within, and the greatest weapon we have is remembering who we are. If you believe stories like this need to be told, explore the worlds we're building. Subscribe to SynthetixScape. The future is waiting.